Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you for joining us today. We are starting promptly to get through a very full agenda. As you join, please go to the bottom of your screen and click on the globe icon to select your language channel. If you want to access the captioning, which is in English, please click on, oh, I don't see it there. Okay, please go to the three dots that say more and click on any of the settings for closed caption. If you have problems with the technology, please reach out to Zsofia, who is our tech person for today. You can reach out to her through the chat. Thank you. I am honored to welcome you to this side event on remedy and reparation for institutionalization. My name is Tina Minkowitz, president of the Center for the Human Rights of Users and Survivors of Psychiatry, your moderator today. The center, which we abbreviate as CHRUSP and pronounce as CRUSP, is sponsoring this event in cooperation with Transforming Communities for Inclusion, TCI, and Validity Foundation. Our panelists today, who are showing on the screen right now, are Bhargavi Davar, Executive Director of Transforming Communities for Inclusion, Víctor Lizama with Red Orgullo Loco, México, Hege Orefellen, a lawyer, and Campbell, Co-Executive Director of Validity Foundation, Stephen Allen, Co-Executive Director of Validity Foundation for Advocacy, and Luhan, Program Manager with Open Society Foundations. Again, please go to the bottom of your screen and click on the globe icon to select your language channel. And I believe that Zsofia has instructed about choosing the captioning, closed caption, and show subtitle. If you have problems with the technology, please reach out to Zsofia through the chat. I will now begin the introduction. In yesterday's Civil Society Forum, I explained that the CRPD Committee's draft guidelines on deinstitutionalization take a reparations approach to deinstitutionalization, as well as calling for a reparations mechanism. This means that we understand that institutionalization is a profound and complex violation of a person's human rights. It includes arbitrary detention, torture and other ill treatment, denial of legal capacity, denial of privacy, denial of an adequate standard of living, denial of home and family life, and more. Deinstitutionalization has to fulfill human rights by stopping the violations, changing law and policy frameworks so that violations do not recur, and working with survivors of institutionalization to repair the harms they experienced individually and collectively. Today, we will explore the topic of reparations with our esteemed panelists in greater depth. We aim for these conversations to be the beginning of work to concretize the transformation of our societies so that they will become welcoming and non-punitive environments for all people with disabilities where institutionalization would be inconceivable. I would like to explain the legal obligation placed on states to provide remedies and reparation to victims of human rights violations. In 2005, the UN General Assembly adopted a set of guidelines on this obligation, which you can read at the link provided. It states that the obligation to provide reparation is based on obligations that states have undertaken to respect, ensure respect for, and implement international human rights law and international humanitarian law. These obligations are contained in treaties like the CRPD, in customary international law, and in the domestic law of each country. Zsofia has kindly put the link to that document in the chat. Forms of reparation include satisfaction, which includes the obligation to cease violations, as well as guarantees of non-repetition, restitution, rehabilitation, and compensation. The CRPD draft guidelines on deinstitutionalization address how these forms of reparation apply to those of us who are survivors of institutionalization. Survivors have been advocating for the use of a reparations framework for many years in our papers, side events, interventions, and other advocacy. Thanks to the current focus on deinstitutionalization, public awareness has been heightened about the need to end this inherently abusive regime once and for all. I believe that reparations offers a useful lens for us to think about what we want from states and from other individuals, and to concretize how these transformations should be carried out. I look forward to hearing the contribution of our panelists on a set of questions I will pose. The first question I will pose to all the panelists, starting with Bhargavi Davar. What is the significance of reparations for institutionalization and forced interventions from a personal, political, and/or strategic standpoint?
Thank you so much, Tina, for bringing in the personal element as well. As a young child, I was witness to the repeated incarceration and violence done to my mother over many years in the mental asylums of India. My advocacy life began then at about age 5 or 6 with questions regarding the care ethic. In a recent interview to Rachel Aviv from the New Yorker, she is chronicling our story. The psychiatrist who treated my mother way back in the early 1970s recalls her and says, she was ugly, a witch, an ugly witch. She was the worst schizophrenic I ever met. He is now 89. My mother passed over 20 years ago, seriously debilitated by the psychiatric drugs, the institutionalization, by this doctor and several others. Naively, I had expected him to say sorry during this interview, possibly among his last, for the harms caused to my mother and to all his other patients. What he actually said was beyond belief, with its menacing horror, lack of insight, and it hurt me. I was part of the women's movement for many decades. In the context of gender-based violence, we could name the violence as violence and help the women seek redress. In the mental health care system, where the violence was so frontal, policy systems at national and international levels are reluctant to name the actions as acts of violence. When this violence is not even recognized, I feel it is important to bring up the obligation and the ethic of saying sorry, even just to retrieve the stature and the dignity to the function of providing support. We work in the local mental hospital. The care workers are walking around in security uniforms and carrying long batons menacingly. However, perhaps all service providers do not feel nice actually conducting the violence. Maybe sometimes they ask themselves if it is going counter to their care ethic. Governments have provided a liberal legal framework for being violent within the care system. Governments should create an ethic of saying sorry. The DI guidelines say a lot on this. Reparation cannot happen where the mental health and incapacity laws exist. Thank you so much, Tina. And over to you, Victor, to respond to this question.
Hi, good morning. First of all, thank you very much to our hosts for this kind invitation. On behalf of the Math Pride Network and its coordinator, Alicia Coordinator, thank you. I would say that reparation is a transcendental aspect, but only if we are willing to recognize the right of persons with disability, especially those with psychosocial disabilities, so that they are included in communities. Society, unfortunately, has normalized a series of forms of violence, not only in mental health services, but in everyday life. I mean, they are reluctant to admit that many practices are violent, especially in mental health services. I can tell you from my own experience that I received a psychiatric diagnosis, that I had very few opportunities to develop a life project of my own due to the imbalance of power in services. Nevertheless, throughout my trajectory as an activist, I was able to acknowledge this problem in general for mental health users, especially for those who have come to terms with their diagnosis and are receiving treatment. Today, as a justice intermediary, I can still see, however, this violence as something that has been normalized and is deeply rooted in the criminal justice system. So reparation must be a commitment by a society as a whole, so that we can truly overcome the effects of trauma and institutionalization. We cannot admit or accept the impunity. There are also tools that follow other approaches other than punitive approaches. We need to implement affordable and accessible processes so that persons with psychosocial disabilities and those who have experienced institutionalization can file reports, or their cases can be taken to justice. Finally, I would say that the inclusion of persons with psychosocial disabilities, that is, those that have been institutionalized, should also take into account differential elements, so that these individuals can become part of communities and we can repair all the harms that institutionalization has caused in their lives. Thank you.
Institutionalization and forced interventions create harm in so many ways. Being taken away from your daily life, segregated from society, and locked away in an institution can be such a devastating and degrading experience, rendering you powerless in the hands of medical professionals or others in charge. Once inside the institution, the violations continue. In the case of forced psychiatric interventions, often with forced drugging with mind-altering drugs, use of restraint, seclusion and isolation, monitoring 24/7, forced nudity, and even non-consensual electroshock, all of which can cause severe injuries, physical and emotional pain and suffering, and deep fear and trauma. After such violence, you may experience that your whole life has fallen apart. Loss of connections, job, house, income, and basic security. You may live in fear of new infringements, be excluded from society, and you may not even seek health care when you need it, or call the police if you are robbed or raped. You do no longer trust state powers. Reparations, restoration of liberty and life, re-inclusion into society, and rebuilding of trust are thus of utmost significance. As underscored in the draft guidelines on deinstitutionalization, state parties should recognize institutionalization in all forms as a multiple violation of the rights enshrined in the CRPD, requiring redress. Politically and strategically, reparation is important for promoting justice for torture and ill treatment and other gross violations of international human rights law, including by raising awareness of the violations, disclosure of truth, documentation and acknowledgement of the facts, and acceptance of responsibility by the state, as well as sanctions against persons liable for the violations. All of this can lead the way to real change, repeal of laws authorizing or contributing to the violations, and prevent future acts. Thank you.
Good morning. Although we know that institutionalization and forced interventions are human rights violations, a form of violence, in the mainstream consciousness, they continue to be viewed as an inevitable part of our societies, desirable and serving a good purpose. There's still an apathy among states towards ending these abominations. There's no sense of urgency around the need to transform the systems, eliminate institutions, and respect choice. Moreover, because many human rights are subject to progressive realization, including some elements of the rights under Article 19, states use this to justify endless delays. An emphasis on reparations can challenge this apathy and the false assumption that it's legitimate to take time to end forced interventions or to plan partial deinstitutionalization to take place over decades. A call for reparations allows us to bring the urgency of the need for change into stark relief. It places the large-scale, gross nature of the violations front and center, and it puts the spotlight on the systemic nature of the issues, undercutting arguments that the rights violations are limited to individual cases of violence or specific institutions where poor care is provided. It frustrates attempts to explain away people's stories of pain and suffering as aberrations in an otherwise functioning system. An emphasis on reparations has an additional strategic advantage insofar as it brings the weight of the international legal framework to the discussion. The redress framework is helpful because it includes elements both of individual and collective redress, including the rights to recognition and non-repetition, which bring in the element of change to structures and systems to ensure that the entire community is protected from experiencing the same violations in the future. Thank you. Over to you, Stephen.
Thank you very much, and it's a real honour and privilege to be joining with COSP and TCI on this webinar. And I have to open my remarks by saying how incredibly touched I am with the experiences that are already being shared. This is what a reparations approach is about. It is about listening, and it is about acknowledgement of harms that have been done. And I too was a child of the institution, having seen my mother for 20 years. In all forms of incarceration and seeing these unbelievable abominations as they've been called. I think from a political and strategic standpoint, a reparations approach has a powerful symbolic effect and the potential to reinvigorate our own collective advocacy on these issues. Although the CRPD brought in a paradigm shift in providing recognition of the equal rights of people with disabilities to liberty, personal integrity, choice and control, we know that decision makers and the psychiatric industry in particular have been slow to respond, and in some cases are fighting back to protect their old models of coercion, control and incarceration. Across Europe and Africa, we have seen that reform initiatives which are led by those who are responsible for institutionalization and forced treatment invariably sideline the victims of these atrocities. It is not uncommon for mental health law reforms to be led by the psychiatric or social care industries, negating the experiences of those who have faced severe and often life-changing restrictions that not only cause them immense harm and suffering, but which are also deeply traumatizing, including for our communities. A reparation approach confronts the inherent power imbalances in our system. It centers the leadership of those most affected and demands that the first step must be that those responsible for the perpetration of these harms accept their responsibility. And most importantly, I think, it means honouring the leadership of persons with disabilities in not only seeking to repair the individual harms that occur in psychiatric hospitals and social care institutions around the world, but recognising that these systems of human control have damaged our own social fabric. It invites those who are responsible to take responsibility. And as such, a reparations approach can be a powerful tool to confront the inherent power imbalances that have prevented us from achieving the true paradigm shift represented by the CRPD. Luhan, I hand to you.
Thanks, Stephen. A great honor to be here with everybody. Good seeing everybody in the participant list as well, friends and colleagues. I think for me, the framework of reparations is necessary and practical, mainly because the bureaucratic alternative just doesn't work. I think we have to remember deinstitutionalization did happen, and it was on a pretty large scale, for example, in North America in the 70s and 80s. And this piece of history today is mainly not seen as part of the civil rights movement, although it was very much part of that. It was seen as an administrative process. It was seen not as a social justice issue, let alone being seen as reparations for people with disabilities who were being moved out of institutions at the time. And I think today we're also seeing a lot of pushback on that piece of history, on deinstitutionalization. At least in the US, many people see it as a mistake, and it becomes a policy debate. People say deinstitutionalization doesn't work, people end up on the streets, mental health system being overwhelmed, and so on and so forth. And when we treat institutionalization as an administrative task, we kind of make the focus about the implementers of the process and not on the people themselves. And people with disabilities take the blame for the broader social consequences of inadequate social protection and what makes our society not very intolerant in the first place. And I think by simply moving a person from an institution to the community, you're not really addressing the harm that's done in the first place by removing that person from society. And we're not really changing the society, the whole society, so that it becomes truly inclusive. So I feel like that's what the value is for the framework of reparations. And I'm really, really looking forward to continue this conversation with everybody. And I think this is really, like Tina said, one conversation to start. Thank you.
Thank you to all the panelists. That was a wonderful set of answers from personal and political perspectives. And I think we have a sense of the great urgency of dealing with the harm that's been done, to really confront it and repair it and put a stop to say never again. The second question starts by asking, how do you see the state's role and responsibility in reparations as compared with the role of grassroots initiatives and the work of NGOs? And I will go to Hege first, and then we followed by other participants. Go ahead, Hege.
Thank you, Tina. I would start by saying that reparations have a particular legal meaning in which acknowledgement of wrongdoing and remedy of victims' harm is central. And as you mentioned earlier, such redress includes 5 forms of reparation: restitution, compensation, rehabilitation, satisfaction, including cessation of violations, and guarantees of non-repetition, all of which are of great importance for victims of institutionalization and forced interventions. Grassroots initiatives and NGOs can play an important role in awareness raising and pushing for reparations, including through strategic litigation. But it is the state that carries the responsibility for providing reparations. Then what if the state fails to acknowledge the wrongdoing and accountability for human rights violations? While international law and jurisprudence can put some pressure on states to implement reparations programs, states can refrain from acknowledging structural violence and discrimination, as is often the case when it comes to institutionalization, forced psychiatric interventions, and other disability-based ill treatment. Practices amounting to torture is still ongoing and unremedied across the globe, and there is an urgent need for redress. International mechanisms could provide guidance and assistance to states, and I would like to use this opportunity to make a call for an international UN-led reparation mechanism for institutionalization and forced interventions. Such mechanism should be mandated to delve into the root causes of these human rights violations and to address the right to truth, justice, remedies, and reparations. For victims of forced psychiatry, where ill treatment for so long and on such a large scale has been carried out under the guise of medical treatment, the right to truth is especially important. We need truth about what happened to us. truth about the consequences, public recognition and apologies as a first step in a process of social reintegration, justice and healing. As a response to the ongoing and unremedied situation of gross violations of international human rights law, including systematic torture, I would also like to call for a UN Commission of Inquiry, a truth and fact-finding mission into psychiatry. Such commission should be mandated to gather and verify information and to recommend measures to provide justice and reparation to victims and hold perpetrators to account and combat impunity. The inquiries should include the testimonies of victims of coercion, violence and abuse in psychiatry and form a historical record of the human rights violations. Such documentation could inform changes in law and practices to end violations. And based on their findings, a commission could call on national authorities to provide reparations. Domestic reparation programs should be established by a legal framework and include consultation with and participation of victims. Who will be the first state to set up a Victims of Institutionalization, Reparation and Recognition Act, and a reparation program for victims of gross human rights violations in psychiatry? Since institutionalization and forced interventions represent patterns of violence against persons with disabilities, reparation is needed on a collective as well as an individual level. Redress should cover all victims of such practices. Thank you.
In my view, the primary role for states in ensuring reparations is to dismantle the oppressive structures that they have created and maintain and that directly perpetrate these forms of violence. It includes acknowledging their responsibility for the violations and the harm that they cause. Likewise, states have an obligation to ensure that state structures facilitate reparations. For example, that courts are accessible, perpetrators of crime prosecuted, survivors have access to legal aid, but also that survivors can access housing, employment, education, personal assistance, and other necessary aspects for independent living. But a wider understanding of reparations for institutionalization and forced interventions goes far beyond state obligations. They require a whole society effort, transforming our ways of relating to each other, promoting inclusion of survivors in communities, and focusing on restoring dignity and respect. Here, in my view, the state's role is limited to providing survivors and communities access to the tools we need to reshape our interactions. It should provide opportunities and options, but not over-regulate organic, independent civil society initiatives. It's important for states to create space for community processes to allow survivors to define their own different and differing needs, but states should not lead these processes. This may look like making funding available for community initiatives, for services provided by civil society organizations and movements of persons with disabilities. It may involve raising awareness of existing civil society services and movements, sensitizing the public on institutionalization and forced interventions as human rights abuses and on the need for reparations, putting in place education and training for those providing services in the community, and including disability and reparations approaches in educational curricula for relevant professionals. States may create opportunities for survivors to participate in public events, such as memorials, ceremonies, and testimonials, but where the state organs themselves play a minimal, if any, role. In essence, states must take responsibility for tearing down the oppressive structures that they themselves have created, but also recognize and make space for communities and survivors to have agency in bringing their own solutions to bear and shaping their own futures. Thank you, and I will hand over to Luhan.
Thanks, Anne. I think that's such a comprehensive list of recommendations that could be recommended to states. I want to add one thing about the role of the government. I think it's important for us to think about what we want exactly from government. Besides what Anne has mentioned, I think that the role of the government also has some sort of role of providing the basis for people to work together to some sort of a collective future. It's both symbolic and materialistic, right? It has to start with understanding of the past, even when the past wrong has not been done by one particular administration or the current administration. And the government now representing its people really has to be able to articulate what kind of future it envisions and back it up with material and immaterial actions. And I think this is where the civil societies come in, especially identity-based organizations, to be able to raise awareness for states to acknowledge that institutionalization is wrong. I think compared to a lot of the other reparations initiatives, when it comes to deinstitutionalization, that first step hasn't been done. And I think the civil society groups, especially youth and survivors groups and people with disabilities, has to be playing that role. And we're seeing this in action with the drafting of the CRPD guidelines on deinstitutionalization. So really, really big applause for all the colleagues on the panel who have been doing a great deal of work on this. And I also want to mention that it can't just be a discussion among disability rights activists and being seen as a grievance from people with disabilities presented to the government. We also have to think about other type of collectives, especially people, those organizations are not identity-based, but hold tremendous political power or discourse power, such as unions, media, community organizations, foundations, human rights organizations in the mainstream. And I think, if we have healthcare workers, social workers questioning their own practice of institutionalization, or if we have foundations challenging their own practice of investing in institutions or institutionalizing practices, then we're looking at a very different landscape for real changes. I'll hand it over back to Tina. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Hege, Anne, and Luhan for those interventions. The international mechanism, I think, is a really important thing for us to look into, and the points about the need for some very concrete measures the state can do without overbearing on civil society initiatives, as well as the role of both identity-based organizations and civil society organizations that have a lot of power, I think are all very important points. A question now to Víctor. Does the concept of reparative justice make sense as a way to conceptualize this more broadly as a whole society effort? Over to you, Víctor.
Yes, Tina. Yes, I believe it's necessary to acknowledge this structural discrimination, which leads some people to be institutionalized, not to mention the effects of being locked up in these individuals. Like, for example, the acts of abuse and the different forms of violence that they experience in these institutions. I believe that it is essential, for example, to start by analyzing what happens with instruments that allow people to report acts or torture. Like, for example, the Istanbul Protocol. This instrument or this tool has a disability perspective. Is it accessible for people who have been institutionalized, who have experienced torture or acts of torture in psychiatric institutions? In my opinion, the answer is no. So the effort must start by identifying who are assessing these situations. For example, if those who assess or determine if somebody has actually lived acts of abuse, violence, or human rights violations, for example, is a representative of the mental health institutions that are being questioned, then that would lead us to a vicious cycle where people institutionalized are trapped. Therefore, I believe that we need to make special efforts to address these mechanisms that allow for reporting of these acts of abuse and forms of violence. And these mechanisms should also be accessible for those people who have experienced acts of abuse in institutions, especially mental health institutions and others. And also, it is important to incorporate a psychosocial support perspective with the reasonable accommodations so that reporting can take place. And obviously, in a more general level, at the social level, we need to identify and confirm that these types of practices cannot continue. I mean, many of them or all of them should be closed because they're just a testament of a society that harbors people that cannot operate properly and ends up victimizing people.
Thank you so much, Victor. I think I agree with you. It's very important to make the torture reporting mechanisms accessible to people in institutions, especially psychiatric institutions. And that should include understanding some of the medicalized practices like forced drugging and forced electroshock as being actually forms of torture. And also the point about needing a psychosocial perspective, psychosocial support perspective with reasonable accommodation. I want to ask one more part of the question and invite Bhargavi to comment on all aspects of the state's role and responsibility compared with the role of grassroots initiatives and the work of NGOs, the whole society effort, and as well, does the reparations obligation help or hinder the creation of political will to make systemic changes in policy and resources? Over to Bhargavi to comment on any aspects of that question.
Thank you so much, Tina. I would like to take off on the social fabric point that Stephen said, and it was elaborated by Victor and some others. So we have bad laws, but can we not have inclusive communities as decent human beings? There is the emerging policy view at the international level that if we build an incredibly large and sufficient number of community support systems, psychosocial services, mainstream services, all of that, then involuntary commitment won't happen. Actually, our experience has been that the existence of the laws has allowed the subversion of morality, where actually committing violence on a person with a psychosocial disability is seen as the right thing to do and not something that you would say sorry for. And this is a legal matter, not just a moral one. We work in the low-income communities in Pune. We see people disappear all the time. When we do field inquiry, we are told that people have been taken to the asylum. They're all decent people who are doing this. The persons themselves refer to their experience of incarceration as kidnap, abduction, and so on. They're always horrified by this. They are betrayed, traumatized, and sad that their families and communities are doing this to them. However, family and community members express very benign sentiments at what they have done. This subversion of morality, what we as humanity feel is the right thing to do, is quite scary and horrifying. The laws are there to impact human mentality, what kind of decisions people make for themselves and about their neighbors, relatives, children, siblings, and so on. If there are laws that allow violence against other human beings, then that law slowly seeps into people. Not that people are passive victims of the law and passively commit the violence because the law asks them to. They are agentive. They are active negotiators of their own interests in committing the violence. Where legal incapacity laws exist, family members in India express legal agency by accusing a wife or a sister as being of unsound mind. Then they benefit in one way or the other, either by easily getting a divorce, by being able to grab property, by being able to take guardianship over someone's finances, so on and so forth. Bystander ethic of preventing institutionalization fails. This is what we have witnessed in the communities. People come together to institutionalize and not to prevent institutionalization. In our work, we try to restore community justice and the ethic of care, but state power has very long arms, which we cannot challenge at the family, community, or the social level. When a person comes back, families and communities expect the person to be cured and a nice, happy person. They ignore the trauma of institutionalization. NGOs, societies, families, and communities mirror the law. Instead of going with the flow, OPDs, NGOs, INGOs, and other community actors need to shift their perspective and not be the good citizens who uphold these laws. Thank you so much, Tina.
Thank you so much for that, Bhargavi. I think that what you have pointed out about the subversion of humanity and especially the impact of laws that actually allow for violence to be done against a certain group of people reminds me of the concept of states of exception by the thinker Giorgio Agamben that some of us have been familiar with and apply to the psychiatric system. I really also take as very important your points about how family members will often create their agency to abuse people using these laws that allow for forms of violence, and that society has come together to enact institutionalization rather than prevent or stop it. Very important points there. I will now ask the third question, and I will turn back to Bhargavi, followed by Anne and Stephen for this next question. Can you share any other reparations initiatives that inspire you or that you see as good examples? Over to you.
Thank you so much, Tina. I don't have much to say on this. I remember Gabor Gombosch, who, as you know, passed last Sunday. May he rest in peace and power. His famous quote from Martin Luther King was like this: "We should never forget that everything Adolf Hitler did in Germany was legal, and everything the Hungarian freedom fighters did in Hungary was illegal." There was a huge judicial remedial process following the Holocaust. In India, looking at the kind of atrocities that happened within institutions, several writers have called it the Holocaust. And so that's the kind of connection that I have when I think of reparation. Something so visibly in front of you like the Holocaust, it admits of judicial process, whereas the thousands and thousands of people who die in institutions worldwide, probably adding up to more than the victims of the Holocaust, did not even raise the question of reparation or remedies. And I think this must be on the moral conscience of humanity as a whole. And I hope that, I also recall the reparation process relating to land and indigenous people. It always touches me when someone comes on a webinar or sends me an email saying, you know, we remember the people on whose land we live. I have often wished in some conferences and events that we wish there was a similar prayer and you know, going down on the knees for people like us who have died inside of institutions and because of the institutional mentality that prevails in our world today. So thank you so much for this opportunity, Tina.
So for me, one initiative that I can draw some inspiration from is the movement in Ireland for reparations and justice for victims and survivors at the Magdalen laundries. Catholic nuns detained young women, often for years, forcing them to work, unpaid, of course, in these laundries. The women were denied education, denied contact with the outside world, and subjected to humiliating and degrading punishment. Their daily routines were strictly regulated. For example, some recount being prohibited from talking while they were working. They were only allowed to sing religious hymns. If they were pregnant, their children were taken away from them and adopted out. Many died. In one institution in Dublin alone, 155 bodies were unearthed in an unmarked grave. The parallels with institutionalization of persons with disabilities, especially in social care institutions, are evident. A movement known as Justice for Magdalens has called explicitly for reparations for victims and survivors. A government inquiry resulted in a 1,000-page report and a €58 million compensation fund, but there was no apology, there were no reparations, and so the campaign continued. In 2018, the compensation scheme was extended to include women who had originally been excluded. And as part of the compensation process, women were given the time to recount their experiences if they wanted to. The results of the campaign were far from perfect, but many of the outcomes that the movement fought for can usefully be considered by survivors of disability-based institutionalization and forced interventions. For example, there was recognition that the church as perpetrator should finance the compensation fund. The movement worked together with the government on what they called a healing journey, including a reconciliation ceremony and public apologies by the government, the president, and the Pope. When a business tried to turn one of the laundry buildings into a hotel and place a memorial within that hotel, the government denied the application following pushback from the movement. The movement also called for a dedicated unit in the Department of Justice to help women access all kinds of services such as housing, healthcare, and psychological support. Freedom of information requests were submitted to bring documentation of the abuses to light. Survivors commented in this process that one of the biggest things for them was that they now felt that they were believed. They were no longer being told by people around them that nuns wouldn't do these things or that you must have deserved it. The Justice for Magdalene's movement helped to end the stigma for survivors and victims and was part of wider initiatives galvanizing society against church involvement in, for example, managing the new National Maternity Hospital and managing the public school system, which is still predominantly run by the church. These movements have also fueled initiatives to amend laws on access to information to facilitate voluntary reunification of survivors with the children who were removed from them and adopted out. For me, the inspiration from this movement is the explicit use of the reparations approach to support calls for specific measures that were identified by survivors themselves as important for their inclusion, restoration of their dignity and humanity, and to meet the practical needs arising from their experiences. Over to you, Stephen.
Thank you very much, Anne, and thank you all. When I think about reparations initiatives that inspire me, it is those that restore and seek to restore the dignity of those who have suffered the most unconscionable human rights violations, but is also about a real commitment to make change. And I think memory has a crucial importance here. I'm thinking even during this webinar about the various institutions that I have been to and seen in my life. The old Fry and Barnet Asylum in North London, with many, many hundreds of people incarcerated in appalling conditions, only shut in the last couple of decades. People in the Balt Neuropsychiatric Institution in Moldova, where we have visited and seen the shocking atrocities faced by women with disabilities. The Gheorghe Șerban Institution in Bucharest in Romania, where I personally visited with our colleagues at the Center for Legal Resources, and they couldn't even account for the full list of people who are supposed to be detained in the institution. Topaz in Hungary, Pastra in Bulgaria, where Rusi Stanev was kept in the most shocking conditions. I think the thing that inspires me about a reparations approach to this topic is it is really about giving us a new set of tools so that we don't forget those that have gone before us, that we memorialize and understand the true shocking pain that these institutions have caused us and have caused our societies for many, many decades. And we commit as a society together to move forward. I think one of the things under international law, I should say, reparations are often evidenced in the maelstrom experienced in post-conflict societies, such as we have seen with the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, often in Africa. And I think these truth and reconciliation processes can be a process to remember the harms, but also commit to change. I would add that many of these processes are fraught with political and legal challenges, and some of them have received severe criticisms from those who have been victimized for being insufficient. But these processes, and as well as moving towards turning our old institutions into memorials themselves, I think can be an important opportunity in our societies to commit together to move forward. None of this is easy, but I think it's inspiring to know that we're also following in the footsteps of many other movements. And I think one of the things the reparations approach gives us is an opportunity to reach out to those populations who have also experienced the most widespread and severe violations in our communities. The path to freedom is long, but if we have solidarity across movements, I think this will strengthen us all. Thank you, Tina.
Many thanks to Bhargavi and Anne and Stephen for those interventions. I think you have all actually mentioned the need to memorialize those of us who did not survive institutions and those of us who are fighters in the struggle who have passed on, like Gabor Gombush, who Bhargavi has recognized and I know was a good friend to many people here. I would like to, I think that the points about the need for survivors to be believed and the measures by survivors that's identified by survivors to restore dignity and humanity and meet practical needs are important to bring out. And also the insufficiency that many reparations initiatives have actually come up against, and despite that, the need to continue struggling for it. The final question to be asked will be responded to by Víctor and Lujan. Are there any other reparations initiatives currently underway in your country, and how might these interact with a call for reparations for institutionalization and forced interventions? Go ahead, Víctor.
Muchas gracias, Tina.
Thank you very much, Tina. I would say that right now in Mexico, we are living a crucial moment. Why? Because recently a reform of the general health law and specifically its elements on mental health were changed. At some point, we need to discuss these issues. We'll have to do that. We need to repair the harm done on those people who have been institutionalized. That's part of the processes necessary to achieve access to justice, and so that the people who were institutionalized can live in the community. And but the approval of this reform forced us to recognize all the efforts we must make so that the public agenda includes the rights of people institutionalized. Seeing them or acknowledging that they are experiencing discrimination, violence, and even torture. And for that reason, it is important for our movement to support users, former users and survivors of psychiatry and persons with mental disabilities can participate in a broad human rights agenda. I live in a country and a region of the world where acts of abuse are constant, where discrimination, the lack of opportunities, and social injustice are an everyday occurrence. So this transformation should also involve other collectives. We need to support other causes and work together with them so that we can achieve a deep transformation with respect for the dignity of everyone, recognizing human diversity, including the dignity of a delusion or madness. I would like to wrap up my intervention in this webinar by quoting a colleague, a friend, a person who lived violence in psychiatric institutions. He's named Antonin Nanto, an artist who a little more than a quarter of a century in a text entitled Letter to Directors of Asylums. What kind of this incarceration am I having? You will never understand that asylums, far from being asylums, are prisons, horrible prisons where those locked up are free and cheap labor that is also comfortable and where brutality is ruled. And you are tolerating all of this in this asylum in the name of science and justice. This is only comparable to barracks, to prisons, to penitentiaries. We hope that tomorrow morning, when doctors visit us, you can remember this. When you try to communicate with these men without the words you need, because you cannot understand them.
Thank you, Victor. When I saw the question of thinking about reparation practices in your own country, it made me think about a lot of different things that I've been thinking about beyond disability. I'm a Chinese person living in America. I think one of the deepest problem with the kind of the social and political situation in China is not being able to look at past wrongs. And that stems from Cultural Revolution to what happened in 1989, all the way to today, what happened in Hong Kong and Xinjiang and Tibet. And I think not having a space and an opportunity to look at these past events and be able to, as a society, reflect on them is a big problem. And shifting back to the US, and just on a side note, I'm hearing all these reparations practice. I think we're all looking at, racial justice, past sterilization for women of color or poor women or women with disabilities. We're looking at land rights, indigenous peoples movement. We're looking at, globally climate justice and the most recent loss and damage approach to global climate justice. These are all really useful learning opportunities. And, I've been asking myself, what can be learned from there? Which one is closer to the issue of reparations for people who are institutionalized? And, it would be useful to see kind of a reparations lab forming across different movements for people to exchange lessons and skills and lessons learned from that. But I think going back to, I've learned a lot of wisdom from the racial justice movement in the US, and, Black people who've been enslaved, has been asking for hundreds of years on reparations for the act of slavery. And I think it only really entered mainstream consciousness in the past couple of decades. And, a few things, I guess I should say, from what I learned from the racial justice movement and the anti-slavery reparations work. One is that the American scholar Olufemi Taiwo had proposed in his book, recommend everybody to read, Reconsidering Reparations. And he says that reparations are a world-making project. So it's not just about money, it's never just about money. Although the talk about money did raise a lot of important discussions within the political structure in the US. But it's really thinking about how the current world system is built with all its baggages and quote unquote necessary evil, slavery, colonialism, and how do we think about structures of the world that is today, and how do we think about the authoritarian practices that we rely on, that Irit has mentioned in the chat, and how do we deal with that? And the last piece I want to say is what I learned from Toni Morrison is, really racism is keeping us to answer other people's questions. These are all distractions. And how do we, in the disability movement, think about what are the other people's questions and what are our own questions? And I think that's useful to learn and to think about for us. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. And we are now going to go into the question and answer part of the program. So I would like to be able to have all the speakers on this screen, and you can all turn on your videos so you will be able to answer questions. So I would like first to just comment on the last interventions. I do think, as Lujan said, the need to look at other movements and learn from them, and also consider how we are relating to them and they're relating to us. What are the other people's questions? What are our own questions? The point about that Víctor made about recognizing the dignity of madness and asylums being prisons, requiring actual reparations, those are also worth bringing out. Let's see what are the questions that we have. I see here a question in Spanish, and perhaps I will.
Do you want me to read it?
Yes,
yes.
Please, Adolfo, please read that out.
Yeah, it says, this question is by Christian Mendoza Vasquez, and it says, beyond the punitive element, a form of reparation of harm would be, for example, treating people with disability, with psychosocial disability differently, beginning by eliminating the institutionalization.
So I'm wondering if any of the panelists would like to address that. I'm not certain what it means to treat people with psychosocial disabilities differently. Is it differently or the same as everyone else? And Stephen has raised his hand to respond.
Thank you very much, Tina. And maybe with permission, I also see another question related to the draft guidelines on the institution.
Please do, yes.
So if I may, I think one of the crucially important components of the draft guidelines on DI, as you've pointed out, Tina, are that they take a reparations approach, which is not a special approach, but it is an acknowledgement of the historic nature of the harms inherent in systems of psychiatry and social care. And to answer more specifically the question about people having to receive care from their elderly parents and not being provided independent living services, absolutely. I mean, I think we, Validity, but also all of the members of the Global Coalition on Deinstitutionalization really want to support your interventions to make these guidelines genuinely effective, responsive to the needs of the diversities of our communities, but also very, very practical. So in answer, I don't think that deinstitutionalization is some special treatment. I think it is an absolute core obligation under Article 19 of the Convention, as well as international human rights and humanitarian law, to which you referred earlier.
Thank you, Stephen. There are a couple of questions that are addressed to Víctor in particular, and one I will read that comes from Irit. Please, Víctor, can you say a little more about what you mean by the dignity of illusion or madness? And I'm going to ask also if Adolfo could read the question asked by Lucila Lopez to Víctor as well. And Víctor, then you can answer them both.
Con todo gusto, Tina.
I'll read Lucila's question in English as for the English-speaking audience. Her question is, Víctor, don't you think that asylums are an expression of life itself in large cities in Latin America? Life between the walls of a city is not materialized in an asylum as a destination with the consensus of a majority.
Go ahead, Víctor, please.
Sure. Let me try to answer these questions based on my own personal experience, because I have a psychosocial disability. as an individual, sometimes interact with my environment that are out of the normal. I believe that this delirium or delusion of madness has to do with accepting human experiences that disciplines of mental health have made pathological, seeking to eliminate them as valid in human experience, like listening to voices internally, like having delusions, like living complex situations, emotionally speaking. I mean, all of that is seen as part of what individuals want to express, but it shouldn't be seen as part of a problem. I mean, as long as we fail to recognize these experiences, the ones of people like me, as valid, we will continue to normalize these treatments and these forms of treating people. And on the other hand, Grecia Guzman is asking, what are the most important points of the legal reform I talked about? I would say that the main aspect of this legal reform is that it seeks the transformation of services, of mental health services, so that they become community services. And on the other hand, it seeks respect for the legal capacity of service users. However, right now in Mexico, there is a lot of concern because there has been a black campaign against this reform. And all of us, including the activists that are fighting for the transformation of these services, are working hard to fight back this kind of attacks that come not only from the mental health system itself, but also from other activists that do not know anything about the human rights approach when it comes to mental health, and do not understand that people with disabilities institutionalized can be categorized right now as victims of forms of abuse. It is important also for colleagues from other countries and activists to be aware of that, so that we can develop together strategies so that this transformation takes place not only in Mexico, but elsewhere.
Victor, I think it's actually very important for us to look more at the reform of the health law in Mexico in other forums, and you point out well the need for solidarity and for actually understanding the institutionalization as a serious harm and human right violation. There are some other questions. There are some other questions in the Q&A that I'd like to just open up for any of the other panelists, perhaps who haven't spoken yet. And one of them is from Edith Roncancio Morales. Good morning, thank you for the space. How to advocate at a global level so that our countries really commit themselves to end the institutionalization of people with disabilities. And I'll ask Adolfo to read it. I'll ask Bhargavi to answer that question, then we'll see if we get to the next one. Thank you. Go ahead, Bhargavi.
Thank you so much, Edith and Tina. My response will be very limited because there are so many things that we all need to do. But a good place to begin practically are the DI guidelines, to build a coalition and to really build a response to these guidelines. There will be many challenges from different stakeholders to stop the guidelines or change the guidelines, or remove many things that we all want to see in the guidelines for deinstitutionalization. I think it's important to connect with all kinds of transformatory groups, such as the women's groups, the human rights groups, and to really advocate for the guidelines in its fullest form. And if we can improve it, I think the Global Coalition on Deinstitutionalization would be very happy to do that. After the guidelines are adopted, I hope that the coalitions will sustain their efforts to really push national policies in the direction suggested by the guidelines. So it's a very long advocacy effort, and working closely with the cross-disability movements per country is really so important, because our experience in TCI has been that if we just stay within the mental health movement, the chances of making any change to the legislations or to the social environment of the institutional mentality, which is the huge barrier for us towards inclusion, that will not really happen. So we really have other kinds of the housing box, the employment box, the education box, talk intersectorally and talk to the cross-disability movement for support. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bhargavi. I see that there are some other questions, and we are coming towards the end of our time. So I would like, if there are any panelists, I think that if there's anything that any panelist sees in the chat that they are interested in responding to, I'd like to invite you to go ahead. And otherwise, I would like to say that we will try to get back to everyone. If you would like to connect with us after the webinar, we will try to answer your questions. And go ahead, please.
Thanks, Tina. Yeah, I saw a question in the chat from Irit, which I'm paraphrasing, but it was essentially about whether the outrageousness of the request for reparations means that the rest of our requests will fall on deaf ears. And I just wanted to address that briefly, because I think the benefit of the reparations approach is that it brings legal obligations with it that we can use to pursue states to be held accountable, despite their reluctance and reticence to do so. But even more fundamentally than that, I think we have an obligation to call institutionalization and forced interventions what they are, as forms of violence, and to call out the obligation to provisions, because that's what victims and survivors are entitled to. And I think we don't need to silence their voices any further because we're afraid that speaking up will fall on deaf ears. And I just wanted to flag, we're in the process at Validity of submitting an application to the European Court of Human Rights for a woman who was trafficked from an institution to a family in the community where they were put in foster care, essentially as an adult, which is in itself another form of institutionalization, as was raised in the in some of the comments that were made here. And we're arguing that this is a form of slavery, because that is essentially what it is. This woman was forced to work on the farm as a woman with a disability in order to be cared for by the owners of the farm. I think we shouldn't shy away from calling out these things and demanding reparations for these unbelievably outrageous forms of violation. Thanks.
Thank you, Anne. I'm just noticing a question by Beatriz Perez asking if it would be a good idea for the UN agencies that have been historically responsible for definitions of human rights and have universalized the state of exception to human rights by attributing mental illness or intellectual disability to people. Would it be a good idea for those UN agencies to make an apology? And I think that's a really interesting idea that that we should definitely look at, and it seems very much in line with what Hege mentioned about the need for an international reparations mechanism. I would like to actually end on time so people can go to their next commitments. We will follow up by email or in some way with others of you. I want to give the floor to Stephen Allen to announce a memorial for Gabor Gumbush. Please, Stephen.
Thank you very much, Tina. And I'm just going to put it straight into the chat box. So in collaboration with Transforming Communities for Inclusion, Validity will be holding an online open memorial event at 8 a.m. this Thursday, New York time. You are very welcome to register for this and also to provide your thoughts and memories, which will be to recognize Gabor's contribution to our field and indeed to this very course today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I want to give a big thank you to each and every one of our speakers today, to the interpreters, the technical supporters, to Validity and TCI organizationally for their cooperation, for everyone who was helping with the chat and with the recordings. You will be able to access the recordings of this event in all of the languages that we have been interpreting on the CRUSP YouTube channel, which I believe that Zsofia is giving the link to in the chat. I also want to make sure to invite again everyone who is survivors of institutionalization, of the psychiatric institutionalization or forced interventions, to respond to the questionnaire on reparations that was in the links related to this side event, and invite again everyone, especially those of any form of institutionalization, to comment on the draft guidelines, of the CRPD committee. Thank you very much, everyone. The webinar is closed.